Welcome. I am Hamilton Davis. I'm the Energy and Climate Director for the Coastal Conservation League. Hopefully you've heard of us. That means we're doing our job. We're a local environmental nonprofit advocacy organization. We're headquartered just down the street from here. And I think after you hear what Mr. McKibben has to say tonight, you're going to be inspired to join us in bringing additional attention to the issue of climate change here in South Carolina, as well as promoting the adoption of our local in-state abundant clean energy resources like solar, offshore wind, energy efficiency. So I want to thank all of you guys for showing up tonight. I want to make sure to thank our partners in pulling this event off. If you walk out into the lobby, you'll see a sign that has about 15 different organizations that are doing excellent work down here in Charleston and across the state. So make sure to take note. Good idea of who you should be supporting in this area. We also have, CCL has a sign-up sheet out in the lobby, and if you get there quickly, you'll get a water bottle after this event. If you sign up for a membership, sign up. You guys don't jump out of your seats yet. Wait for Bill. Bill McKibben is a well-known environmental author and activist. He's the founder of 350.org, an international climate change campaign, which is named for the safe level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, 350 parts per million. When he's not busy organizing, Bill's an active writer on the climate crisis and other environmental issues. His 1989 book, The End of Nature, was the first book to warn the general public about the threat of global warming. Read that book, it's fantastic. He also wrote a book, it's published a couple years ago, called Earth, with 2 A's. It's probably the best book I've read on climate change, and I certainly recommend that everyone who's interested in that topic pick that up. Bill's a frequent contributor to various magazines, including the New York Times, the Atlantic Monthly, Harper's, Orion Magazine, Mother Jones, the New York Review of Books, Rolling Stone, and Outside. He's also a board member and contributor to Grist Magazine. He's been awarded Guggenheim and Lyndhurst Fellowships and won the Lannan Prize for Nonfiction Writing in 2000. He's currently a scholar in residence at Middlebury College and lives in Ripton, Vermont with his wife, the author Sue Halpern, and his daughter Sophie. I think we're lucky to have Bill here with us tonight to talk about a topic that's especially relevant for coastal cities like Charleston. So please join me in giving him a warm round of applause.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here, and especially a pleasure to be on a stage on behalf of CCL, which is, there are 6 or 7 great regional organizations like this scattered around the country, and this is the one for this part of the world. And Dana Beach is an amazing organizer, and the work that's been done here and will be done here is absolutely key. I feel like it's a gorgeous day out there, and what fun I've had wandering around Charleston all afternoon with my wife, and I come here to the most beautiful of urban campuses maybe on the planet there, with the moss hanging from the trees and the beautiful late evening sun, and pull you all inside, and my work is basically just to bum people out. So I apologize for that. I feel bad about it. I'll get through that part of it really as quickly as I can and on to what I hope is more hopeful things, but it must be said that we are in a crunch, and we need to understand the scale and the pace of that crunch in order to understand what we're going to do about it. As Hamilton said, I wrote the first book about all this stuff way back in 1989, 25 years ago, at which point it was mostly an abstract idea. We knew that burning coal and gas and oil put CO2 in the atmosphere, and we knew its molecular structure trapped heat that would otherwise radiate back out to space. We did not know how fast it would happen. The story of the last quarter century is that it is pinching harder and faster than we would have expected. So far, human beings have raised the temperature of the Earth about That's a kind of, am I causing that to, do you think to, let's see if I, which, I only see one up here. Oh, I'll try this one. I'll try this one, see if it works any better. We've raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree, which doesn't sound like an enormous amount, 1 degree Celsius, 1.8 or so Fahrenheit. It really isn't that much. I mean, per square meter of the Earth's surface, we're trapping the extra equivalent of about 3/4 of a watt of extra solar energy at the moment. So less than one small white Christmas tree light per square meter of the Earth's surface. The trouble is, there are a lot of square meters in the surface of the Earth. So another way of doing that calculation, which someone performed this summer, was to say we're trapping the extra heat equivalent daily of 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. That too is an abstraction. To really understand what's going on, you need to look at the effects to understand what that kind of heat is like. It has been enough to melt the Arctic. By the end of last summer, 80% of the sea ice that was in the summer Arctic 40 years ago was gone. It has been enough to fundamentally change the oceans all around us. They are already about 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago. On land, that extra heat is enough to change the heat trapping capacity of the atmosphere. Warm air holds more water than cold. And so the atmosphere is about 5% wetter than it used to be, which loads the dice for both drought and rainfall on scales that we have not witnessed before. And we see those around the world every day. We are, and this is the hard part, still at the beginning of this story. The same scientists who told us that we would raise the temperature 1 degree by this point tell us with robust confidence that that 1 degree will be 3 or 4 or 5 degrees before the century is out, unless we very quickly get off coal and gas and oil, far quicker than any government currently plans. What will that do? It will make it almost impossible for us to have civilizations of the kind that we are used to having. The agronomists at Stanford and the University of Washington calculated a couple of years ago that from this point on, each degree increase in global average temperature should cut global grain yields about 10%. It's easy to see how that can happen. Last summer, 2012, across the Midwest, we had the hottest summer that we've ever had there, and it got too hot for corn to fertilize. On the richest farmland on Earth, you really couldn't grow corn. Trillions of kernels of corn failed to fertilize. If you therefore increase the temperature 3 or 4 degrees, and you cut, therefore, the number of calories on the planet 30 or 40%, we cannot have a world like the one that we are used to having. You guys, I think, must feel this more intuitively than most people on Earth. I walked along the seawall today in Charleston. The oceans, I mean, the city is basically at the same level as the ocean now. The scientists couldn't be clearer. The least sea level rise that we can expect in the course of this century is about 3 feet. That means that when big storms come, that ocean is going to, and big storms can come more commonly and more powerfully in this changed world, that ocean is going to overwhelm everything around you, and it's going to happen very quickly. It was instructive for me to be looking at the graveyard there at St. Michael's and understanding that, you know, the history of this place goes back a long ways. That it's easy for people in Charleston to imagine what this town was like 300 or 275 years ago. In your imagination, you have no problem figuring that out. Some of the streets are still the same cobbles, you know. Trying to imagine what it's going to be like 75 years into the future then should not be too hard a task for you. And if you were paying attention, if you were imagining what it was like, then you would be doing absolutely everything you could think of to make sure that we avert as much of this crisis as we still can. We can't avert all of it. We've already, I mean, stopping global warming is not on the menu, but keeping it from getting worse than it has to get, keeping it from getting to the point where it just overwhelms all of our coastal cities, all of our ability to grow food, all of our biodiversity, that maybe remains within our grasp. And it's that maybe and what we can do about it that I really want to talk about tonight. When we get to questions, I'm happy to go back and answer, try to talk as much as you want about the specifics of what's happening in the years ahead, but the outline I've just painted for you is more than enough to understand what kind of world we're headed to. Another way to say it is, the most important thing that's happened in the lifetime of everyone in this room is that we have left behind the Holocene. Sometime in the last 20 years, we crossed some invisible line, and on the back side of it was the Holocene, the 10,000-year period of benign climatic stability that coincides, and not coincidentally, with the rise of human civilization. We're past that now. We've raised the temperature enough that we're out of the Holocene. We're into something else that doesn't really have a name. And the question is how far into that we're going to go, and that depends on what we do. Now, the question of what we're going to do is usually approached as a kind of question of technology. And I could talk about that for a fair piece, but I'm not really going to, because I think that's the easy part of the answer. Human beings are good at technology and engineering. It's what we're good at. And we're doing the work that we need to do here with great rapidity. 25 years ago, when we talked about solar power or wind power, we still kind of did it with our fingers crossed. You know, it wasn't really ready for prime time. But that has changed. The engineers have been as effective as the scientists in understanding the dimensions of the problem and dealing with it. And so we look at the few countries that actually took this seriously and see tremendous results. In Germany this summer, Germany's the one non-Scandinavian country that's really given it a good try, you know. There were days this summer in Germany when they generated more than half the power they used from solar panels within their borders. Okay? And this is Germany. You know, Munich is north of Montreal. Very few people, you know, in the grip of winter blues think, oh, you know, I'll take a sunny vacation in Dusseldorf, you know. Think what a country could do that had, oh, I don't know, the Carolinas, California, Florida, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, places like that to work with. We might get someplace. The trouble is there are more solar panels in Bavaria than there are in the United States. And that's because they've summoned the political will to do something about it. They've gone to work. They've created the set of incentives and things that got them going. And it is painful to reflect on how little we've done along the way. It's not just rich countries like Germany. Other places around the world. I just did a piece about a year ago for National Geographic on energy in China. Yeah, the Chinese have made plenty of mistakes, and most of them guided by us and our technology. We sold them a lot of coal-fired power plants, and they put up a lot of coal-fired power plants. So they're producing a lot of carbon. Per capita, they never come near us. But still, they're driving much of the growth in carbon emissions. They're also putting up a huge amount of renewable energy, more than anyone in the world. Those of you who've been to China know that one of the things you see when you get to most Chinese cities now are rooftops covered with solar hot water panels. 250 million Chinese, so almost the US population, get their hot water from solar panels on the roof. Is this because they have some secret technology that they haven't told us about? It is not. I spent a day with the head of the biggest of these solar hot water companies, an engineer who's now a very rich engineer, because he's put up about 60 million of these solar arrays around China. And we spent the day talking solar power, but then at the end of the day, he took me into his private museum. And he, you know, pictures of him with famous people and things, but there on the floor, was an old rusting solar hot water panel. Oh, that's my favorite thing I own. Do you know what that is? No, I don't know what that is. That's one of the panels that Jimmy Carter put on the White House in 1979 and Ronald Reagan took down in 1985 because, you know, we wanted manlier forms of energy than that, you know. It's galling to look at that and realize the time that we've wasted and the leads that we had and the chance that, well, now we've got to catch up and we've got to do it really, really fast. And the reason that we're not, and here's really where I've been leading up, the reason we're not doing it is not because we lack a series of answers. You know, for 25 years, I've watched the best scientists in the world go up to Capitol Hill every year and explain to them that the worst thing in the world is happening. And then I've watched the best economists, left, right, and center, go up to Capitol Hill and say, look, the first step of this solution is pretty easy. You put a price on carbon to reflect the damage it does in the atmosphere. It does not make sense to have one industry, only one industry, allowed to pollute for free. Nobody else does it, you know. The restaurants along King Street don't, I mean, the cheapest thing for them to do tonight at the close of business to get rid of their trash would be to shovel it out in the middle of the street and leave it there. But you wouldn't do that because soon you would have rats running up and down the street. Sort of the definition of civilization is you clean up after yourself unless you're the fossil fuel industry, and then you get to pour this stuff out for free. We won the argument, the scientific argument and the economic argument. We've just lost the fight. And the reason we've lost the fight is because of the power of that industry. They are the richest industry in the history of the world. No kidding. I mean, Exxon made more money last year than any company in the history of money. And it doesn't take a huge amount of that money to make sure that nothing ever happens in Washington and many other capitals. Looking at Washington this week, one's reminded that it's almost impossible to get even the simplest things to happen. But if you want to block something like a price on carbon, you can do it pretty darn easily. And so, at a certain point, I kind of looked up and thought, you know what? It's unlikely that writing another book about this is going to move the needle in a substantial way, you know? Which was not a fun realization for me, because what I like to do is write books, okay? I'm a writer, and that means I'm an introvert. You can tell by listening to me that I'm not a great orator or speaker or things. I mean, you're very nice people, and I'm happy to be here with you, but truthfully, I'd rather be home, you know, in my office typing. That's what I like to do. But at some point, we figured out, a few of us, that we're never going to match this industry for money, so we're going to have to find other currencies to work in. And the only ones we could think of were the currencies of movements, you know, passion, spirit, creativity. Sometimes have to be willing to kind of spend our bodies. And so 5 years ago, we started 350.org. When I say we, I mean me and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury College in Vermont, where I teach a little bit, a college demographically identical to, say, this one here. Same SAT scores, same, you know, handsome student body, same, you know, everything. We had this somewhat ludicrous idea that we would try to build this global movement to do something about climate change. That's why we're called 350.org. Hamilton explained the scientific basis, but you wouldn't normally pick a scientific data point as your rallying cry, you know, except that as we thought about it, we understood that one of the big problems for organizing around the world would be everybody insists on speaking their own language, you know. Happily, Arabic numerals cross those linguistic boundaries pretty easily. 350 means the same thing, you know, in Charleston and in Chile and in China. And so we went to work. I mean, it was ludicrous. We had no money, we had no organization. We did have 7 undergraduates. There are 7 continents, so each one of them took one. The one that took the Antarctic also had to take the internet, you know, and off we went to do our work. And Our job first was to find other people like ourselves around the world. There's not everywhere someone who calls themselves an environmentalist, but everywhere there are people working on hunger, on women's rights, on peace and war, on development, on public health, on all the things you cannot have on a planet that's just rapidly degrading. So those were our natural allies, and we tried rounding them up, and we said, we're going to start by having a day where we try to just sort of take this number and put it into the bloodstream of the planet a little bit. We picked a day in the fall of 2009, about a year after we'd started, and asked everybody to do something that day. We didn't know how well it would work. We got the first sense it might work well 2 days early. We were sitting around our little office, borrowed office, around a table, the 8 of us, and doing, laptops open, doing our work, and the phone rang. It was a satellite phone, and it was our leader in Ethiopia. Like all of our leaders, like me, a volunteer. Like many of our leaders, like many of our leaders, 17 years old. And she said, the government took away our permit for Saturday. She was in tears. The government took away our permit. So we're doing it today before they can stop us, which was brave, but that wasn't the reason she was crying. She just kept saying, we want to do this the same time as everybody else. We wanted to be part of this whole big global thing. We're sorry if we're spoiling it for everybody. We wanted to do it all at once. And right now we have 15,000 young people out in the street in Addis Ababa chanting 350. So, I was like, wow, don't worry about the date, it's okay. And for the next 96 hours or so, the pictures just streamed in from around the globe. The next one actually came from U.S. servicemen in Afghanistan, made a 350 with sandbags, sent us a note saying we're parking our Humvee for the weekend and walking, okay? We have, before the weekend was out, there'd been 5,200 demonstrations in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. And I could show you lots of pictures all the way along. I'm going to show you just a few, because I want you to see, those of you who are engaged in this fight, who your brothers and sisters in this work are. The folks at CCL who do this work on a daily basis, and all those other organizations that have helped sponsor this. The kids who are on their way to Power Shift next week, this big national gathering of college students working on climate. I want you guys to see who you work with, and I want the rest of you to see, because I hope you'll join too. One of the things I'd always heard was that environmentalism was something that rich white people did, and that if you had to worry where your next meal was coming from, you wouldn't be an environmentalist. And it did not take long, looking at these pictures as they flowed in, for me to understand that that was just nonsense. That most of the people we were working with around the world were poor and black and brown and Asian and young, because that's what most of the world consists of. And what do you know? They're as interested in the future as anybody else, maybe more so because the future bears down hard on you if you're in those places, There's the Congo River, someplace above Kinshasa, near the spot where Joseph Conrad, in his Eurocentric way, identified the heart of darkness on our planet, and it's very poor. They didn't have a digital camera, so they, tried to develop in their home darkroom. It didn't come out so well, so they wrote in what their banner had said. But there they were, fully engaged in this work, and people all over the world the same way, creatively. There's one that should strike a note with you all, okay? Big involvement of religious communities for the first time in this work. There's the head of Muslim South Africa, the head of indigenous traditions. There's the Anglican Archbishop who succeeded Desmond Tutu at the head of a big multi-faith march across Cape Town. There's our biggest evangelical college, liberal arts college, Billy Graham's alma mater. I'd been to Bethlehem to do some organizing. Hard place to get to, but everybody wanted to help because the Dead Sea is shrinking very rapidly as temperatures rise. Now, there's too many military checkpoints in the way to everybody to work together. So the Jordanians said, we'll make the big 3 where we are. The Palestinians said, we'll do the 5 in Palestine. The Israelis did the 0 on their beach. It was a beautiful day to see people putting aside their other things to deal with, and shame on us that we can't even get our political parties to put aside their endless bickering to do something. We had 300 big demonstrations across China. And that's a hard place to do this work. One of them did get busted up by the police, but the others went off, and that's continued to build. Those are our allies in the Maldives. That's Student Government Association in the Maldives, meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate their problem. The Maldives is a gorgeous place, one of my favorite places on the planet. It's an archipelago of many, many hundred islands strung about 1,200 miles across the equator in the Indian Ocean, okay? It's been their continuous culture for 5,000 years. Its odds of making 5,100 are pretty slim because the highest point in the whole archipelago is about 1.5 meters above sea level. It's as if the entire United States was Charleston, okay, and much too poor to be able to figure out how to build a, whatever defenses you guys are going to, try for a while anyway to build here. But they're fighting hard. Bless them, they're doing a great job. This was the biggest story on Google News for about 36 hours, more coverage of it than anything else on the planet. And the reason, I think, was that the people involved didn't look the way editors thought environmentalists were supposed to look like, There's Yemen, which might be the toughest place in the world right now. And all the women in that zero are wearing full black burqa. So to us, they don't look like members of the Sierra Club, okay? But their hearts are in exactly the same place. They're not thinking about themselves. They're thinking about the future. They're thinking about their children. They're thinking about the larger creation that we've been asked to guard. And it was inspiring. I mean, lots of inspiring stuff. There's the oil-rich sheikhdom of Abu Dhabi, all right? And you can see some oil-rich sheikhs down front in their dishdashes. But these are smarter than some of the other oil-rich people on Earth. If you look behind them, you see the edge of the largest solar array on our planet. These guys are, I think, intending to remain rich no matter what, and more power to them. There were also 300 or 400 pictures that just ended up in a file marked 350 adorable, okay? And they were adorable, and they were also hard to look at. Those girls are probably going to be refugees in the course of their lifetime. God knows where they're going to go, and through no fault of their own. So we keep doing this kind of work. Since then, we've had 4 or 5 more huge days of action. We've organized about 20,000 rallies in every country on Earth except North Korea. I could show you pictures. There's about 40,000 pictures in the Flickr account. I won't subject you to all of them. I'll just show you a few because they give you some sense of the beauty of this work and the way that there's in Auckland, that's 100 bike mechanics getting ready to fan out across the city. They just walked into people's garages and things and made sure that every bike they could find in the city was working so no one would have an excuse for not riding to work, I mean, people are brave. Planting a tree in Somalia is not an easy thing to do. Coming from places I'd never heard of and places that I'd grown up hearing in other contexts, and all of it beautiful and moving in many ways. Along with science, we talk a lot about art because we know that environmentalists have done a better job of appealing to the sort of side of the human brain that likes, bar graphs and pie charts. And it's important also to reach us where we live, viscerally. That's 3,000 people in Brighton assembled by Tom York of Radiohead to make an image of King Canute trying futilely to hold back the rising waters. We did this day of action with images, thousands of people, and each of them so big that we had to borrow satellite to get the pictures, They called it the biggest art project in the planet's history. There's that scarab beetle is pushing solar panels across the desert, and that's a huge polar bear. That was my favorite of all. That's a dry riverbed in Santa Fe. The Southwest, of course, has been in epic drought now for many years. And when the satellite came over, 3,000 or 4,000 people put blue blankets overhead to kind of bring the river back to life just for a minute. So we're proud of this work that we've been doing. We've done a lot to kind of communicate the truth about climate change and the trouble that we're in all over the world. And we found people quite responsive to the science, able to understand it, able to deal with it. People said, oh, much too complicated, 350 parts per million, carbon dioxide, no one will get it. We found that that's not true at all. Most people are able to deal with the concept of here's how much there should be and we have more of it than that, you know. It's like going to the doctor and the doctor says your cholesterol's too high. That's the moment at which most people say, okay, what pill do I take? Most people do not demand an entire disquisition on the lipid system, and only idiots go home and search the internet for websites that say cholesterol doesn't exist, you know. So we're happy with this educational work that we've been doing, and it's been useful and all of that. But at a certain point, and we're actually well past that point, education's nowhere enough. There's got to be a certain amount of engagement too, of real willingness to fight. And so that's what's been going on the last couple of years. And some of you may have heard about this battle over the Keystone pipeline that began a little over 2 years ago. It had actually been going on a little bit longer than that. Our allies, our friends, Tina, do you think there might be a little water someplace that I could find? I'm dry. Our allies up in Alberta, mostly First Nations people, Indigenous people, had been pointing out for a long time that this tar sands project that was underway up there, this effort to get take the dirtiest stuff on earth, this oil mixed up with sand, and I mean that it was destroying an enormous area, like an area the size of Scotland or Florida. Or, I mean, I was up there this past summer. For those of you who are Tolkien fans, if you want to know what Mordor looks like, you know, go visit. It's unbelievable. So they'd been, I mean, literally the biggest tailings ponds on Earth is with this filled with the water that's left over from this. And whenever you're up there for hundreds of square, there's this cannon going off all the time. Boom, 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 because they have to keep birds from landing on this stuff or else they die instantly. It's like a war against nature, and nature is definitely losing, you know. But so they'd fought this fight for a while, but nobody paid that much attention because it's a long ways away, and you know there's a lot of bad stuff going on around the earth, and how do you sort of prioritize? In the spring of 2011, Jim Hansen at NASA, our greatest climatologist, and his team put out a paper saying, you know what, it's pretty important to pay attention up there. If you could burn all the recoverable oil in Alberta tonight, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 would rise from its current level of 400 parts per million, already 50 parts per million too high, the reason that the Arctic melts and everything else. It would rise from 400 parts per million to 540 parts per million, just from this one part of Canada, you know. Along with 8 or 10 other big deposits of carbon around the world, this is stuff we clearly have to keep in the ground. There's just no other way around it. So when we heard that, we thought, thank you very much. You're welcome. Very much. When we heard that, we thought, much better. When we heard that, we thought we better fight this, even though everybody says this is a done deal and there's no chance. The National Journal, the kind of trade paper for Capitol Hill, published a poll they did of their 300 energy insiders that spring. 97% of them said that TransCanada Company would have the permit to build its pipeline by the end of 2011, a permit from the president. Despite that, we went to work, because we felt we had to. And the first part of that job was asking people to come to DC and get arrested. I wrote a letter, and Wendell Berry and Naomi Klein and several other people signed it, and we sent it out, and what do you know, people showed up, and in numbers. 1,253 people went to jail over 2 weeks. It was the biggest civil disobedience action in 30 years in this country about anything. And then it spread quickly. The Canadians, a couple of weeks later, had their biggest civil disobedience action in many years. And then around the world at consulates and embassies. And then that fall of 2011, we followed the president all over the country. Every place he went, every college he went, he'd be greeted by lots of friendly students, and they'd be chanting, "Yes, we can stop the pipeline." And we surrounded the White House with people 5 deep, shoulder to shoulder, around the 1.5-mile perimeter of the White House. And 4 days after that, the president said, "Okay, we'll take a year and study this thing." And that year is now over. More than over, and sometime in the next 6 months we expect a decision. This has become the iconic environmental fight of our time, not only because of the results in Alberta and keeping that oil in the ground, but just because at this point, if the president did the right thing, it would be the first time that any world leader has ever said, "Here's a big project we're not going to do because of its effect on the climate." And if that happened to be a big deal, sooner or later we have to do this. Sooner or later we have to leave stuff in the ground. And if the president said that, it would be the most useful thing that he could do to restart those international climate negotiations that fell apart at Copenhagen in 2009, you know. So it's a big deal, and we keep pressing. We had a day of action 3 weeks ago. We had 215 cities and 47 states across the country where people were drawing a line against Keystone. I was in Seattle, and we had thousands of people in red shirts along Puget Sound, you know, and it's beautiful and important. And I hope that you will add your voices to that. Make sure, especially perhaps those of you who voted for President Obama, that he understands that this is the reason, the kind of reason that one voted for him. In this case, because it's a presidential decision, he doesn't have to ask John Boehner or anybody else for permission. He can just say no himself, and darn it, it'd be a good thing if he did. There are a lot of other fights like that going on around the country right now. We're trying to stop these big coal export ports on the Pacific coast, and of the 6 of them that have been proposed, we've managed to block 3, and the other 3 are in serious trouble. We're working hard on mountaintop removal in the Appalachians, on trying to stop fracking in those places where it's occurring, and it's occurring in ever more places around this country and around the globe. We're involved in a big battle up the coast in Maryland, where they want to build a huge liquefied natural gas export facility to take all that frack gas out of the Appalachians and send it abroad, on and on and on, okay? We have to play a lot of defense. But playing defense alone isn't enough. It's like the little Dutch boy trying to plug the dike. There's just too many holes and too few fingers, you know? We also have to play offense against the fossil fuel industry. And that's what we've been trying to do in the last 8 or 10 months with this campaign of divestment around fossil fuel. I wrote a piece last summer for Rolling Stone magazine. Those of you who keep your back issues, it was the one with Justin Bieber on the cover. And but the funny thing was that this piece I wrote went viral. I got a call from the editor saying, your piece has 10 times more likes on Facebook than Justin's. And I was like, wow, that's pretty good, you know. I was, it's sort of my soulful stare, I think, is sort of, mostly the reason. But the point of the piece and the reason that it went viral is because it had new numbers about where we are. And the numbers came from financial analysts, mostly in the UK, who'd done the work we should have done a long time ago. They sat down with all the SEC filings and annual reports of the fossil fuel industry and the countries that basically operate as fossil fuel companies, think Venezuela, and they added up all the stuff they had in the ground, in their proven reserves, the stuff that they have identified and they've told their shareholders and bankers and investors that they will get out of the ground. And it turns out that they've already identified 2,800 gigatons, 2,800 billion tons worth of carbon in the ground that their business plan is to remove and burn. The trouble with that is that the scientists are quite clear, the computer modeling is completely clear, that if we are to hold temperature increases on the planet below 2 degrees, which is the one red line that every nation on Earth has agreed to, we cannot burn 2,800 gigatons. We can only burn about 500 gigatons more carbon. All right? So they have 5 times as much coal and gas and oil as anyone thinks would be. I mean, it's not like 2 degrees is safe. 1 degree melted the Arctic. We really shouldn't be finding out what 2 degrees are going to do, but we're going to. That's probably about if we did everything right, it's about where we'd stop, But these guys want not to do that. They want to overwhelm the atmosphere. And when you know those numbers, you understand that this is no longer a normal industry. It is a rogue industry. An industry that we have to figure out how to slow down. One of the ways that we're trying to do that is with this divestment campaign. It's reminiscent of the one 25 years ago against companies that were doing business in apartheid South Africa that some of you may remember. And that one was successful. When Nelson Mandela got out of prison, the first place he came was the United States. He went to California. He went to students in the UC system to say thank you for forcing the divestment of $3 billion worth of stock in apartheid-tainted countries. He said, we liberated ourselves, but we could not have done it without you. We needed that kind of pressure. And we need it again. Not because we can bankrupt Exxon, but because we can politically bankrupt them. We can weaken them some. We can make it harder for them to carry out their work. We can do to them what we did to the tobacco industry a generation ago. Made it harder for them to dominate the political system and exercise their will. It's not the only thing we need to do, but it is a useful thing. And so it is good news now that on 380 college campuses in this country, there's an active fight. Even in the first 10 months, 7 or 8 of those colleges have divested their holdings in fossil fuel. There was a study from Oxford University last week saying this is the fastest growing divestment movement in history, and that it represents a real threat to the valuations of the fossil fuel companies. 15 or 16 big cities have now divested. Seattle, Portland, Providence. I think it's no accident that a lot of those are coastal cities. Remember the mayor of Seattle saying, we spend already tens of millions of dollars figuring out how we're going to cope with sea level rise. Why would we be investing the city's money in the companies that make it necessary for us to do this, Now big religious denominations starting to do the same thing. The United Church of Christ, which in some ways is the oldest of our religious denominations, trace their roots back to the Pilgrims, this summer announced that they were recommending divestment to their churches. They said it's really not sensible to pay the pastor by investing in companies that are running Genesis backward, And so this movement is on, and I hope that you will join it. I hope you'll join it here at this college and in this city and use it as a vehicle to call into question the legitimacy of business plans that every scientific model points out are insane. I mean, there's just no other way around, no other way to describe a business plan that guarantees the worst thing on earth happening that's ever happened. Last year, we did another one of these big days of action around the planet. We asked people to rally in places that had already felt the sting of climate change, and we were amazed by how many. The day starts, and there were thousands of these that turned out that day. The day starts in the Pacific, so the first ones came from underwater in the Marshall Islands. Their coral reefs, like everybody else's coral reefs, are being wrecked by the hotter, more acidic ocean that we're bathing them in. You'd think people in Afghanistan had other things to worry about, but the fact that the Kabul River is drying up's a big deal, Drought in so many places, sea level rise in so many places. Some places the problems are a little less severe, but if you like to ski, the disappearance of winter is a real issue, Forest fire across the boreal north, all around the world, that's Siberia. Sea level, these people are evacuating their homes in Micronesia. That's where the level of the dead, that top red balloon is where the level of the Dead Sea used to be, by the way. That picture came from India. It just had a note, it just said, there is no water behind our dam anymore. These people are from the part of Pakistan that had the opposite problem. In 2010, the worst flooding we've ever had on this planet, of kind of flooding you can only have in this hypercharged, warmer atmosphere, left about 25% of the nation of Pakistan underwater and 20 million people out of their homes. It's as if everybody from Baltimore to Boston had to evacuate in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. I mean, just almost unimaginable, you know. The same stuff all over the world. There's my home state of Vermont, where we're still dealing with the effects of Hurricane Irene, you know, which covered our farm fields with sand and silt. But the same thing all over the world. That was the smallest demonstration that we had. It's just some street that had turned into a little muddy river in Haiti. But the reason it stuck in my head was just what the sign, your actions affect me. And it's true. More people died in Haiti from Hurricane Sandy than in New York. There's still a cholera outbreak underway there. Your actions affect me, but not vice versa. There's not a damn thing that they can do. They don't burn enough fossil fuel for burning less to make any difference. They don't have the headquarters of the biggest fossil fuel companies on Earth close to home. They can't be, you know, with a day's travel outside the gates of the headquarters of the world's sole superpower. That's what we can do. That is our job to do. Along with all the things at home, along with changing our light bulbs, along with making sure that we're signing up for green energy, along with doing the kind of obvious, wonderful things that groups like CCL do to preserve their particular place, we also need you engaged in this larger fight and engaged in serious ways. I'll end just by telling you briefly about, I was just thinking about it today, about that civil disobedience action we did 2 years ago in Washington. And there are two things about it that stick in my mind. One is, well, I'm looking at the demographics of this room. One is, when we sent out the letter asking people to come, one of the things we said was, we don't think college kids should have to be the cannon fodder here, go to jail. Be the only ones go to jail, okay? I mean, college kids, young people have led this fight all over the world. You've seen their pictures, you know. But if you're 22 right now in our economy, you can make an argument that an arrest record may be a suboptimal item on your resume, okay? One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, you know? And so it was with pleasure that we watched a lot of people with hairlines like mine arrive in Washington. We did not ask people as they were getting arrested, how old are you, because that would be rude, but we did ask, cleverly I think, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administrations. On the last day, there was a guy arrested with a sign around his neck that said, World War II vet, handle with care. He was old enough that he'd been born in the Warren Harding administration, which was long enough ago that even though I studied history at college, I'd forgotten there was a Warren Harding administration, okay? The point is, young people, it was very good to see your elders acting like elders for once, you know? Really doing the sort of thing that in a working society, community, elders are supposed to do. Bear some of the brunt, take some of the sacrifice for ensuring the future. The other thing we asked people was that if you're going to come get arrested, would you please wear a necktie or a dress when you come? Okay? Now, not because you know, we're big on, I mean, I live in Vermont, you know, you can go many a year without wearing a necktie in Vermont. But we wanted to make a visual point that undergirds everything I've been trying to say here today, which is there's nothing radical in the least about what we're talking about. Nothing at all. All we're asking for is a world that works the way the one we were born onto works. All we're asking for is a world that works somewhat like the way the world's worked for 10,000 years, the only period that we know human history through. That's not a radical demand. If you think about it, that's a deeply conservative demand to be making. Deeply conservative. Radicals work at oil companies. If you are willing to get up in the morning and make your fortune by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, then you are engaged in an act far more radical than anyone before you has ever even conceived of. I mean, one hears about wild-eyed 60s radicals and things. I don't know. None I've ever heard of thought they were going to change the temperature of the planet, This is craziness. And our job is to figure out how to check that radicalism before it overwhelms everything good around us, To act with some tiny amount of the same kind of foresight that, the people out there buried in the cemetery of St. Michael's Church did. I mean, when John Rutledge sat down and helped write the Constitution, he was actually thinking 100 years ahead, 200 years ahead. We're clearly not, for the most part, because we're doing things that are guaranteed to make life impossible over that period of time. So we need people engaged in that fight. I should stop here. If I was a good organizer, I would. But I'm a writer at heart, and the job of writers is to tell the truth, and as best you can see it. And the truth is, there's no guarantee we're going to win this fight. We may have waited too long to get started. For the moment, physics is clearly winning, and it's going to take a few breaks. It's going to take not just great organizing, we're also going to have to catch a break or two from the natural world in order not to see the kind of worst happen that we fear. I don't know whether we're going to win or not. I do know something I didn't know 5 years ago, which is that we're going to fight. And it's going to be the most important fight that humans have engaged in their time as a species. And you've seen in those pictures some of the other people around the world who are willing to engage in that fight, many of them in places that have done nothing to cause this problem. It's the great honor of my life to get to stand shoulder to shoulder with them and with you in that fight, and I look forward to doing it. Thank you all very much.